Hello, everyone, and welcome back to What If Grad School is Useful Actually, your favorite Hope Corps professionalization podcast for grad students, postdocs, and other evolving academics. Today, we are going to talk about a question I honestly cannot believe we have not addressed sooner. And that question is, if you have trained to be an academic professional and you are looking for a non-academic job, where do you find them? And if you are not in the world of higher ed, if you are listening to this podcast to support someone you love who is in the world of higher ed, that question might not make a lot of sense to you. But if you have been professionalized in higher ed, particularly if you've been on a path where you were trying to or thought you were going to become a tenure track faculty member, there are really only four places that you look at. Want to work at a specific higher ed institution, you might look at that institution's website to see who they are hiring. If you are a member of a professional organization, like let's say the American History Association, and they have a listserv, you might check there. But really the two main places that you're going to focus are going to be the job boards on the Chronicle and on Inside Higher Ed. That's where you're going to see most of the jobs. Occasionally, a higher ed job will migrate to LinkedIn. That's very weird. That doesn't happen often. And that's not where academics look for jobs. So, if the question you want answered is, I want to know simply where to look for jobs and what job boards are best for what type of jobs, I'm actually going to answer that at the very end of our conversation today. So if that's the only thing you want an answer for, you can fast forward to the last 2 minutes of today's episode. What I'm going to spend most of the time talking about today before we get on where to look for jobs is how to look for jobs, and specifically unlearning some of our academic professionalization and training on the job search process. So I'm going to start by telling a story about my personal experience that, if I do my job well, will tie this all together and help make a lot of sense. And if I don't do my job well, it will just be a confusing ramble. But here's fingers crossed that I do this well. So when I decided that I wanted to go to grad school, I made a list of schools that I wanted to go to, and then I assessed how many I could apply to based on application fees and paying for transcripts and all that kind of stuff. And I narrowed that list down, I think, to four schools, four or five. But what's most important is that I had never been to any of the places where these schools were. They were all across the country. I had only ever lived in Eastern Washington. I had never been further east than the middle of Montana. And I was applying to schools on the East Coast, in the Midwest, etc. I had never been to any of these places. And spoiler alert, when I finished my master's and applied for my PhD, I very much did the same thing. I made a list of schools that had programs I wanted to be a part of. I narrowed it down based on my favorites and how many I could afford to apply to. I applied to those, having never been to any of those places, and I got into one, and I went there. So I moved across the country twice, sight unseen, to new schools and new adventures. And I have to tell you, when I was applying for faculty jobs, I was prepared to do that all over again. So my PhD is in American Studies. My dissertation focuses quite a bit on American Studies, history, communication, and feminist studies. I had two graduate minors in feminist studies, and I taught extensively in it. So the 2 years that I was on the job market, I applied to, I think, every American Studies job and most jobs that were in feminist studies or, related, women's gender studies, women's studies, etc. So I applied to these jobs based on where they were. I think one year I was on the job market, there were 40 jobs, and I think I applied for 30 of them, right? And so, of course, realistically, I had not been to most of those places, and I had not been to any of those places for a substantive amount of time. Maybe I was nearby for a conference or something like that. But that is just a very expected part of the academic job process. And there's so much that I want to say on that, but I'm trying to keep this episode to the point. So I'm going to rein myself in and we can talk about classist assumptions that are embedded in the academic degree process later. All I'll say for now is that I'm not actually that unhinged in that way. That's a very normal thing for academics looking for jobs. Even when they start looking for grad school, it's like, yeah, I may never have lived outside of Eastern Washington, but I am prepared to move myself to North Carolina sight unseen for the right graduate program. And, from there, I am prepared to move myself to North Dakota sight unseen if I get a tenure track job. That is the nature of the market. That's the nature of how we work. There's not a ton of jobs. You go where the job is. And that is one of the first things that we have to unlearn when we are looking for non-academic jobs. So as I said, in my areas of expertise, I think there were under 100 jobs for each of the years that I was on the market. And that's not super uncommon. You could look at history, you could look at English, even the STEM jobs. There's not a ton of them. There's certainly not enough for every candidate who is applying. So you're kind of expected to go where the job is, and you don't think about it too much. It's sort of expected that if you get that tenure track offer, you will learn to like where you're at. Or if you don't, you will work very hard and publish a lot. And when you come up for tenure, you will apply at other places and go someplace you like that way. Not the most straightforward best system. So there are many, many, many more jobs in the non-academic space, and you could apply for jobs wherever you want to be. And so I have a revolutionary way of coaching folks through making this transition, and it is simply this: look for what you like. I know, wild. But we have to unlearn this mentality of I will go where the job is and start to think, if there are jobs everywhere, because there are, where do I want to be? Do I want to be close to family, or do I want to be close enough? Do I want to be in an urban environment or a rural environment? Do I want to be someplace where I can do a lot of surfing, or do I want to be in the mountains? And if I'm in the mountains, do I want it to be like desert mountains where I can do a lot of hiking, or do I want it to be forested mountains where I can maybe do some seasonal skiing? Do I want to compare the price of living in different places and see where my dollar will go the fastest? Do I have, or am I thinking about starting a family? And if so, do I want to look at different school districts or the dating scene, or, whatever that might be? The first way to start to look for jobs in the non-academic market is to think about where you want to be and how you want to work. So do you want to be hybrid? Do you want to go into the office every day? Do you want to be remote? Do you want to be mostly office, but have an employer who is a little bit flexible if you need to be remote for any reason, etc.? Because the job market is so vast that all of these things are available to you. And so the first thing, when you are thinking about looking for a non-academic job, think about where you want to be. And I mean that specifically. I mean that geographically. Think about where on the map you want to be. So that we can start to narrow it down, because truly one of the biggest shifts from going from an academic job market to a non-academic job market is there are so many jobs, and it can be so incredibly overwhelming. So that is my first piece of advice, is think about where you want to be. Think about a place that you would love to live. And I think that this is really important because I am a millennial, and if there's one thing that millennials know, it's that jobs are not forever, right? And so you don't want to move across the country because you found one really great job and then get there and find out that it's not the right fit for you, or, circumstances in your life change suddenly and it's not as good a fit as it was, or something like that. So, when you are in a place that you just like to be, you like the environment, you like the things to do, you like the kind of accommodations, etc., it's much easier to then say, okay, well, maybe, this is no longer the fit for me, but I like this area. I feel supported here. I've built a network of friends and associates. I can look for something else in this area. So that is really and truly my first piece of advice. And I know it seems simple, but please don't discount it. Please don't blow it off. When you are approaching this process and thinking about where you want to be, really do give that some thought. So, for examples, I know people who love to ski. That is how they blow off steam. They look forward to it all year. And so they have looked for jobs in areas that have really great skiing. I also know people who their main form of stress relief is surfing. And so they only looked for jobs in areas that had really good surfing. I know people who have decided that they want to live in Germany. And so they have looked for jobs in Germany. That takes a little bit of extra work, but it is 100% doable. And I've worked with people on that process. Some people want to be in an urban area that has a good cost of living. That's going to give you a few select cities to look at. Some people want to be, maybe they don't want to work on a campus anymore, but they want to be near a campus. So they want to be in a college town, right? And so that's going to limit your options too. Again, some people want to be near family. Some people want to be near a major airport so they can see their family when they want, right? So really and truly think about your perfect place and then look for that place and then look for the jobs that are there. That is the first way to kind of start narrowing down this process that can be really overwhelming when there are hundreds or thousands of jobs instead of just, 50 or 70 or 30. All right. Now I will tell you my favorite platforms to look for jobs and the order in which I recommend folks use them and why I like them. So for folks who planned on being a tenure track professor, and are now looking at other careers, and you have been in higher ed for some time, you've gone through a lot of higher ed professionalization, and the non-academic job market just seems like a completely different, it seems like a circus in a different language. It's very confusing and overwhelming. The site I recommend the most is idealist.org. And this is not sponsored. I wish it were. But I love Idealist. Idealist is a job board just for nonprofits. And one of the things that sets it apart as a job board is that you can kind of search by values. So, if your research, my research focused extensively on reproductive justice. So when I was first looking for jobs, I would go to Idealist and I would type in like reproductive justice, and I would get all of these jobs related to my research area where I could use my knowledge and my training in kind of a new way, right? So that's one thing I like about it. But what I really like about it is because it is for nonprofits, it is kind of values first. So they give a extensive and meaningful explanation of the values of the nonprofit and how this role serves those values. And so if you are new to looking for jobs, you can start to see, what sort of key terms and what sort of roles are often associated with the values that you're looking for, because graduate students and postdocs and faculty are very values driven people. I have found they want to do work that they feel makes a difference. They want to do something that they're passionate about. And I mention that the descriptions on Idealist are meaningful because companies will put up kind of a boilerplate statement of values on other job firms, but they are almost so encompassing as to be not particularly helpful. And I find that that's not so much the case with idealists. So if you are making that transition, you have never looked for, or it has been, many, many years since you have looked for a non-academic job, and you are easing yourself into how to look for a non-academic job, I recommend Idealist. Not because you have to work for a nonprofit, although you can make a good living working for nonprofits, but because it is a really good way to start to do that translation of, okay, what kind of keywords, what kind of roles, what kind of skills are associated with entities and positions that share my values. So Idealist is a big one I recommend for someone who has kind of trained themselves to start doing this work of translation between academic skills and non-academic job skills. The biggest job platform right now, it is still Indeed.com. There's a lot of things that I like about Indeed. I like the easy apply feature. I like that you can get fairly quick feedback on if your, resume has been moved forward or not. It's the biggest job platform. You will find a lot of stuff there. You can also look for jobs on LinkedIn. Um, LinkedIn has some good features. I like that you can search for unicorns if you are interested in working for a startup. It is very location based, which I find kind of frustrating. You can search for remote or hybrid jobs, but if you just have a LinkedIn account, whatever kind of like city you told it your last job was in, it's going to give you jobs in that city. So if you haven't updated it since you've been in grad school, if it still thinks you live in your hometown, fix that so you can get more accurate jobs. So yeah, those are my takes. I recommend Idealist first because it is so good in helping with that work of translation for your skills, and so good at helping you find values driven work. From that, you can kind of graduate to looking for jobs on Indeed. Of course, you can always go to a particular company's website. And once you kind of narrow down where you want to live, let's say you wanted to live in the Pacific Northwest, and specifically in a coastal region of the Pacific Northwest and in a more urban area. So that is going to narrow it down for you pretty much to Seattle and Salem, right? So then you can go in and you can look at, who are the biggest employers in and around Seattle and Salem? Who are the best ranked employers? Do they have hybrid or remote positions in those areas, etc.? And then you can go to that you can get a list of companies and you can go to their specific websites and see what they're hiring for as well. So I hope that this helps. Next week, we are going to have our special guest, which I am so, so, so excited for. This is a person who is very near and dear to my heart. You'll hear all about it in next week's introduction. If you have other questions about how to start looking for non-academic jobs and where to look for them, do not hesitate to leave those in the comments. I will answer those questions in the next podcast or as soon as I can. And I'm working on a very special episode all about government jobs and entrepreneurship as well. So that will be coming up as kind of an alternative, but this is just a quick guide to how to get started. All right, we will see you guys again next week.